Thank you so much, Saba, for joining us for this really important discussion of the legacies of Brown. Now, I know you have a long career trajectory in working around advocacy for education equity. You have yourself been an educator. You have also worked with LDF on our education work, and then you were also a senior political staff under the Obama administration related to education. And currently, you are the co founder of Brown's Promise, which continues to advocate for education equity. So clearly, this is something that you know a lot about and care a lot about. And I'd like to start with having you just share with us a little bit about what your motivation is, right? Why have you invested so much of your life and professional career in advocating for education equity? And what's the major thing about this topic that you think most people don't really get yet?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's always fun to come back to LDF in any capacity. I would say my motivation, like many people, is from my own personal experience. First, as a student growing up in a school district under desegregation order in Florida, and then as a teacher at a racially isolated school in Southeast DC. My mom grew up attending segregated schools in Florida, and my dad immigrated here from Ethiopia in the 70s to attend graduate school. And I really watched my parents use education to achieve the American dream. My mom eventually got a PhD. My dad had an MBA. Despite just innumerable faces they challenged. And they wanted me to have an excellent education. And they made sure I went to the best schools outside of my predominantly Black neighborhood in Tampa. And it was clear to me at a young age that they were making sacrifices to make that happen, and that I was receiving a totally different education than kids in my neighborhood. And I knew at a young age that wasn't right. So I just felt this sense of injustice even at a young age. So after college and working at LDF as a paralegal, I taught middle school in Southeast DC. And I was 23 years old, freshly graduated from Stanford, working at a school that was 99% Black and then located in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. Our school is incredibly under-resourced, and I saw my students who had all the potential in the world just not receive the quality of education they deserve, the education I received. So those two experiences, I think, both understanding the transformative impact of education on my life and my family, and understanding the devastating consequences of being denied educational opportunities, really drove me to pursue a career in education. And for the things that I would say people don't understand, just be pretty simple. Equal often isn't good enough. We talk a lot about equality, but in many senses, equal spending, for example, doesn't mean equal education opportunity. Equal class sizes or equal counselor-student ratios don't mean an equal education. Equal resources in schools serving students who are bringing vastly unequal needs into those schools set us up for a continuing cycle of not serving those students well enough. We need to be thinking about what students need at in their individual communities, at their individual schools, and really challenging ourselves to reach educational equity.
Thank you so much for sharing both your personal biography and how that contributed to your understanding of, what we need and what we're missing in education work. Because I think that we tend to think equal is the same. And so since you had this comparative experience of kind of, having a more resourced education and also having relationships with people who didn't, your peers who didn't have that. And you also had the opportunity to teach in a less resourced place and compare that to the opportunities that you had to go to school, that's a kind of beautiful social experiment where you can kind of see how important education is, and in terms of how we can encourage people to actually be able to do the kind of mobility work that your parents were able to do. And so I want to ask you to think about or share with us why equal isn't good enough in terms of like a personal story as well as professional. So when we think about what would it look like for us to equalize educational opportunities, like to have true equity, not the same, but true equity in how people are educated. What difference did that make in your life? And what difference would that make in the lives of students and in the lives of educators and in our society if we actually did accomplish this goal of not equal, but more than equal?
So I will use the example of the school that I taught at, which, and an interesting twist of fate was Sousa Middle School and was part of the Brown cases. Sharp versus Bowling was the case that took place as a consequence of segregation at Sousa. And there I was, in early 2000s teaching at a school that had undergone a deseg order, but was predominantly Black. So just an interesting historical point there. But my students they came from, like I said, one of the poorest communities in Southeast DC. I think most people know that DC for a long time has had a relatively, it looks like on paper, a relatively high per pupil expenditure. And so often people will look at that and even in those early years say like DC has so much money, like it should be doing so much better, like they're squandering money away. But in reality, you come to Sousa and when I was teaching. So first off, I was a Teach for America uh, core member. And that meant that I was emergency credentialed. So my students, who at that point were in seventh and eighth grade, had been at schools with lots of turnover. Several of them had not gotten the literacy support and instruction that they had needed. So they arrived in seventh grade with challenges, right? And here they are getting a teacher who had very, very good intentions. And I think I was good enough for a first year teacher, but they were students that needed like a heavily experienced, well versed in literacy instruction, credit recovery type of teacher. And I was not that. I cared deeply for them. But I knew, even starting off, I was surely better than not having a teacher at all or not having a teacher that didn't care. But that's one example. My entire grade of teachers, I think, except two, were new to the school. And so right there, right, like here we are, we have so much money in DC and we have a school with high needs, a high number of kids living in poverty. We had a housing project close by and they're getting brand new teachers, many of which have never taught before. So like right there is a huge equity issue that if you looked again at just like the numbers, the per pupil expenditure, you would say, well, those kids are getting more money than some suburban kids. Also, as I said, we had a high number of kids living in poverty. We had a high number of kids who had disabilities, and we did not have supports for those students. We just did not have it because those supports cost a lot of money. And even with the high per pupil expenditure, we weren't giving many kids what they needed. And we had kids who didn't have like necessarily, classified disabilities, but I had kids who watched murders happen in front of them or had just experienced extreme community violence, have to just like come to school the next day and have zero support to get through the school day. And so again, this idea that like equal money or equal number of teachers or equal number of books would have made that education better for them is just not accurate. Like they needed a stronger set of supports that we just simply were not offering them. And so, to ask why we don't see students performing at higher levels, given that, I think is just really the wrong question, right? Like we aren't giving students we weren't giving students what they needed, and therefore we were not seeing the outcomes that we would have wanted.
That's such an important distinction, the difference between equality and equity, right? And treating everybody the same is what we think of as equality, but not acknowledging and not giving people what they need. Like equity is about ensuring that you get what you need. And, if you and I literally have different eyesight and we're sitting in the same seat, right? Like, yeah, it's not going to, some of us need a stronger prescription or need glasses in order to see what's in front of us. And giving students what they need to actually make a sense of the educational environment and use that environment to achieve their highest potential is what we're talking about with equity. Whereas equality is like, you get this one book and you get this one book. And so you have the same thing, but it may not be meeting people's needs. And so, with that frame, kind of understanding the difference between equality and equity, let's turn to school segregation and the Brown desegregation order and kind of help us unpack was Brown going for equality as we understand it, or equity as you have explained it to us?
I think that the architects of Brown, all of which were LDF lawyers, very smartly recognized that the equality of resources was not going to be possible under a system of de jure segregation. That it just simply would not happen. And that even in this like make believe world of like, we're actually going to give the students at the segregated Black schools the same books or, the same facilities, that even there, as the opinion recognizes, there would still be kind of intangible differences in the type of educational resources that would be provided to students. So I think the beauty of that decision is this recognition that a system of Jim Crow segregation in public education just could not produce equal educational outcomes. Um, what I think we have then seen post Brown is that once we obviously prohibited the use of de jure segregation in schools, there wasn't the second part, I think, of the conversation of this equity piece of even when we have kind of numerically integrated schools, are we actually providing students within those schools what they need? And I think that's a conversation that is hard to have on the front end in litigation. And it's something we, saw as schools integrated, as we saw, schools deal with the fallout of, of a country going through a civil rights era, that racism still persisted even in schools that were under deseg orders. And so there had to be even kind of more school specific and more kind of persistent remedies and policy solutions to address the persistence of racism and racial prejudice in schools. And I think we've learned that, right? That like exclusionary discipline, for example, is something that I don't know that on the front end litigators would have thought like, oh, we're gonna, when certain teachers have biases, we're going to end up with disproportionate use of exclusionary discipline. They wouldn't have, known that on the front end. We weren't even using exclusionary discipline like that in the 1950s and 60s. And so I think we've learned that you have to pay attention to tracking and exclusionary discipline and over identification of students for all kinds of things. So I think that's one thing we've learned from post Brown. And then I think also is just the kind of persistence of efforts to get around Brown, right? That like once de jure segregation was lifted and there was white flight and just de facto segregation happened, we know, Milliken prohibited the use of cross-district regional integration plans where there wasn't evidence of intentional discrimination by suburban school districts. That I think was a huge blow to efforts to have meaningful integration to counteract the impact of white flight. So I think we've learned a lot, but none of that I think should lessen the import of that original decision and that original commitment to equal educational opportunity that Brown stands
So
for.
we can kind of think of it as as a goal that gets more clear and more refined kind of the closer we're working towards that. And so, we in Brown, this landmark decision, they're kind of setting our true north. And then as we are taking these steps to get there, we're seeing more of the nuances and the ways in which people are maybe trying to avoid the goals of Brown. And then we have to further refine our measures and metrics to ensure that we're getting to the spirit of what the Brown decision was about. And, I am surprised that, I guess, as you were, to be teaching, 20 years post Brown and still have this like very intensely segregated school that you were teaching in. And I think a lot of Americans, myself included, at the beginning of my education career, kind of felt like, well, that was solved, right? That was then. And now we don't have, those issues. And so, when you talk about some of the things that we had not anticipated and some of the ways in which the goals of Brown have been, let's say, hindered. School discipline is one of them. What are some of the other policies and practices that actually limit our ability to, as of today, but hopefully not forever, um, not experience the full promise of the Brown decision?
So, one thing we talk a lot about at Brown's Promise, and I think we are excited to see this topic come up so much in current discourse, especially around the 70th anniversary, is the role that school district boundaries and attendance zones play in furthering segregation. School district boundaries cause two-thirds of the racial and socioeconomic segregation in this country. They segregate kids from each other, and they segregate often kids of color and low-income kids from educational resources. We know that we use school district lines both as our kind of unit for funding schools, and we use it as how we the base for how we assign students to schools. So we know that, when school districts are raising local funds, they reap the benefits of property taxes within the school district. They don't get to partake in monies that are raised outside of the school district. And for the vast majority of students in this country, you go to school in the school district that you live in. And so that we're limited to the schools in that district. And so we've seen that school district boundaries, as I said, really have this ability to limit the possibility of integration in this country. There are just towns across this country. We've looked at it at Brown's Promise, where we have kids, 10 minutes from each other, divided by an invisible school district line. And we all know in our heads can think of a town like this where the educational experience is
Hmm.
night and day, right? Like literally across the railroad tracks. That
Hmm.
doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense to reinforce a system of school district boundaries, which of course like play a role in administration. And I'm not at all suggesting we shouldn't have school districts, but we need to pay attention to the impact that they are having on school segregation and resource inequities. We change our congressional zone, our congressional districts every 10 years, and yet we, treat school district boundaries like they cannot be changed, even when we know that they are driving such serious inequities that frankly cannot often be overcome, even with changes in school funding formulas. And even when we have, changes in those school funding formulas, I don't think we should be satisfied with a system of school district boundaries that allows so many kids to go to school, in schools where they aren't going to school with anybody that
Hmm.
doesn't look like them.
And in thinking about these school district boundaries, how much of this is the natural consequences of where people live, and how much of this is kind of political decisions that we're making? So I'm thinking about a more recent study um, that was done where a sociologist was kind of explaining that while school segregation isn't necessarily as high as it was in the pre-Brown era, we actually do see that school segregation is still very high, as your experience has been sharing with us, and that in very large in very large urban districts, I believe the research is showing that residential segregation and racial segregation is actually decreasing. Um, but we're not seeing that in terms of the construction of school districts, or we're not seeing that in terms of having more educated or more less segregated schools. And so I believe the scholar is suggesting that this is showing that our backsliding is more around politics than it is around demography. And so, can you talk a little bit about the politics that are driving this uh, turning away from the commitment to having these more integrated schools and what we can do about it?
I think that that same study from Sean Reardon and Ann Owens does credit much of the backsliding on our country's um, release, frankly, the release of school districts that were under desegregation orders for many years post Brown. We know that many of those school districts that were under court supervision, and so therefore, as everyone at LDF knows and does great work at doing, when a district is under court supervision, there are kind of strict adherence to court orders around the population of schools, if you close schools, if you open schools, what type of programs are at certain schools. And that's what kept those school districts integrated and kept attention on the equalization of resources between schools in a district. And so in the 80s and 90s, we saw many of those school districts released from court supervision. And without that supervision, school districts were permitted to allow for school attendance zones just based on neighborhoods. And so that is where you can see some rapid resegregation happening, even just within a district. And because it was not caused by de jure segregation, it wasn't caused by intentional efforts to segregate kids, there's not going to be the same legal claims present as a result. And so that's, I think, part of the backsliding. Also, in places where I think people were hoping to have voluntary efforts, so outside of court supervision. We know that even those voluntary efforts post the PICS decision, those voluntary efforts are still legal, of course, but I think there has been greater scrutiny on those programs and then the limitations on the types of strategies that can be used to increase diversity in schools. And I want to continually emphasize that it's still legal and we still hope and support, and our many school districts still, I think, attempt to create diversity at the K-12 level. But I think that has been a chilling effect legally on the types of, like I said, the types of strategies that can be
Could you
used.
say a little bit about the PIC decision for the non-lawyers like myself?
Sure. Just throwing out court cases. Yeah, sure. That was a case that examined two integration efforts, one from Seattle and one from Louisville, Kentucky. And parents in both cases challenged the school district's efforts to diversify their schools because they were using a system of assigning students that took race into account. And so that decision rightfully and thankfully said diversity is a compelling governmental interest, a compelling interest that school districts can pursue, but it has to do it in these race neutral ways, and gives examples of strategies that can be used. And I think there are still school districts that are using those strategies. We saw most recently Thomas Jefferson Magnet School in Virginia using race neutral strategies, and those strategies were affirmed by the Fourth Circuit, another case that LDF was involved in. So certainly school districts are using them, but I think, the fact that there are limitations on what districts can do, I think has caused a chilling effect. And then certainly we know just the political climate. I mean, in a country where people are passing laws limiting the types of books that students can read about African American history or Latinx history, the ability of school districts to try to champion diversity, I think, is really challenging
Mhm.
in many places. So I think the combination of these kind of legal changes plus this kind of hostility towards diversity efforts have really facilitated some of the backsliding that we've seen.
So I'm curious to hear your insight on what we can do right now to reaffirm our commitment to school integration. What are the things that you would lift up for us to be active in?
Yeah, certainly at Brown's Promise, we are transparent in our support for litigation and advocacy that compels school districts to pursue desegregation. We're really excited to see state level cases. There's three right now, actually, one in Minnesota, one in New Jersey, and one in New York City, all using state constitutional language to challenge the state's really facilitation and maintenance of a system of segregated schools. So I think us all paying attention to those cases and supporting those cases is important. And certainly, at Brown's Promise, we are hoping to replicate those cases in other states successfully. State constitutional language can be, as we've seen in those cases, a springboard for pursuing state level action. Because this really, to us at this point, there's likely to be more movement in state courts. But I would like to see more than litigation. The advocacy can also facilitate this goal, right? And unfortunately, we don't see that much legislative advocacy around, for example, changes to school district boundaries or support for interdistrict transfer programs or support for magnet school programs, the kind of financial support it would take to create these opportunities for making district boundaries more porous. We also support the ability of districts to be able to regionalize school funding, meaning that we, like the way I talked about school funding being, centralized to one district or another. We don't think that makes sense. We think there are situations in which countywide districts sharing money makes sense, or a regional approach to student assignment and school funding. So I think support for creative solutions to increasing integration and an openness, right? Like we all have to, I think, realize that this is a challenge for us across the board, for communities across the country. And it means letting go of the idea like my kid has to go to the neighborhood school, that the goal of having great schools, well-resourced, integrated schools should be one that we all share, even if it takes sacrifice from all of us.
Thank you for laying out those actions that we can take and for helping to clarify that we are not done with Brown, that, there is still much work to be done, and there are ways in which we can proactively kind of join in that commitment. And that leads me to our closing question. As you very well know, this is the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board decision. And so at LDF, we are celebrating it with our tagline, "We are all Brown." And so I wanted to give you a few moments to share with us what that phrase means to you when you say "we are all Brown."
I love that phrase. And we are all Brown, to me, means that we all benefited from the impact of the Brown decision. That momentous opinion signaled the end of Jim Crow segregation in this country and the beginning of the realization of what this country could be at its strongest, which is a multiracial democracy where all people have an equal chance to live up to their greatest potential.
Well, thank you so much, Saba. I really appreciate this conversation. I have learned so much. Thank you for joining us on that. Hope that you have a fabulous day.